Scandal magazine charging criminal libel.
I am going to file a $25 million libel suit against Confidential magazine for the scandalous article that was printed in the current issue of Confidential magazine.
It was a rag. Attacked famous people for no reason, insinuated a great deal, said very little.
And I am fighting not only for my reputation, but for the reputation of every entertainer and good American in our country.
Confidential's victims were the most famous names of the time. The scandal printed about them took America's breath away in the straight-laced moral climate of the 50s. Confidential claimed, for example, that Maureen O'Hara had made love in a cinema seat.
It shocks me to realize the availability of this magazine and this type of literature on practically every newsstand in the United States.
Confidential was the first magazine to report on the murky underside of Hollywood. Its reputation soon spread, and in no time it had built up a network of people who were willing to leak stories on the stars.
They were coming from agents, they were coming from managers, they were coming from ex-wives or ex-husbands. They were coming from former lovers, whether they be involved in a homosexual relationship or a man-woman relationship. From mothers, fathers, brothers, cousins, disgruntled employees, studio heads, PR people, reporters, police officers, anyone who wanted to make a buck to sell a story.
In the 1950s, Hollywood's dazzling first nights had become almost state occasions.
This is a great night in Hollywood, ladies and gentlemen. I might even say it's fabulous.
People still believed in the glamorous legend of Hollywood. There were still megastars, and they'd become America's royalty.
You had your Errol Flynn's and you had your Bogarts and your Gables, you know, very colorful characters because they were assured a paycheck every week. And when they played very, very hard. And they were, from a columnist standpoint, they were a very, very good copy.
The Hollywood columnists worked hand in glove with the studios to promote this image of a town filled with flawless talent. One of the most powerful columnists of the day was Luella Parsons.
With Luella Parsons' wonderful title. Luella, welcome here as the first guest on our TV show, A Star is Born, and Jimmy McHugh.
Thank you very much, George. We won't talk because you have so many wonderful stars waiting to get into this so wonderful picture.
Confidential was undermining the make-believe world that people like Parsons had created.
Thank you, Amanda. Mamie Van Doren, now this outfit, I think you should kind of let us step back and see that.
It was a world of wholesome, healthy people.
Lee, how are you?
I'm Jack.
Lee Liberati.
Jack, my mother.
It was a time of respect for the flag and the family.
Hello, Jack.
I can say it's nice to have some fellow Milwaukeeans here, you know?
Certainly is.
Confidential was the only publication in America which dared to question this idyllic picture. The studios had convinced millions of people that the Hollywood stars shared the values of middle America. The studios saw to it that scandal simply didn't exist.
Talent of our generation, Miss Judy Garland.
The studio bosses had complete control over the stars' public and private lives.
All wanted them, Jack Horner.
Even stars of the magnitude of Judy Garland had to sign contracts which contained a morality clause. This was in fact a threat that if they misbehaved and it became known, they could be fired. Yet the studio's demands drove Judy Garland to a life of drugs and drink.
I want to tell you that I've never seen so many.
What terrified the studio bosses was that informers were leaking damaging information to Confidential magazine. A front-page splash in Confidential could devalue their stock. the stars themselves.
It spread a lot of fear and a lot of terror because it was still a period when reputation meant something. Remember, in those days, they would invest an enormous amount of money in building up, developing, and sustaining a star. I think they regarded the men and women, that their stars, as pieces of merchandise. So in effect, it hurt the merchandise.
Louis Mayer at MGM was just a total tyrant. You know, he cracked a whip, and he was an insufferable bastard. You know, nobody liked him. Harry Cohen at Columbia, another studio head that made his stars just jump through hoops. He dictated their entire lives. He'd call them at 2 in the morning, want to know who they were in bed with. I mean, he had Sammy Davis beaten up because he dated Kim Novak. In real life, if you dated a black man or a black woman, that was the end of your career.
Sammy Davis Jr. thought he could openly date Kim Novak, but Harry Cohen, head of Columbia Pictures, had ruled that Novak would be a star whatever the cost. Then there were rumors that Kim was going to marry Sammy. Cohen saw his investment under threat.
Harry Cohen had a friend who was very, very big in the Chicago mob. They had 2 boys from Chicago, flew into Las Vegas, and they took Sammy Davis out in the desert. I heard this from, let's say, a mob source, a mafia source. They took Sammy Davis out in the desert, and he'd already lost his one eye in an automobile accident. There was a sharp stick on the ground, and one of the men picked up this sharp stick, said, "Sammy, you've got one eye left. You want to keep it? We want you to marry a black girl within 24 hours. That night, Sammy Davis, half drunk, and this can be verified, jumped on the stage at the Silver Slipper, which is kind of like a little burlesque joint they had in Vegas. A singer and dancer, and it was one of the most gorgeous black girls you've ever seen. Her name was Lorraine White. And Sammy got up on the stage and proposed to her in front of the audience. And this girl, a very young girl, naturally very impressed, because Sammy was a major star. And she said yes. And Sammy Davis did indeed marry Lorraine White, I think within 24 hours the next day. And I knew Lorraine, and I saw her maybe a year later. I said, "Whatever happened with you and Sammy?" She says, "Well," she says, "he never slept with me. The marriage was never consummated. At the end of 6 months, he gave me $25,000. We got divorced." That was it, the end of the story.
We will return to Hollywood Confidential on Discovery Showcase. Confidential now returns on Discovery Showcase.
Confidential was treated as sort of a joke at first, and even Humphrey Bogart said that everybody swears they don't read it, but it somehow gets into their houses, and they all claim that the cook brought it in. Well, they certainly did read it in those years.
Confidential was a terrible shock because the public didn't know this. It was just the people in the media, and, you know, in the industry that knew what really went on behind the closed doors of those mansions in Beverly Hills.
People loved to gossip. They wanted to feel better than their idols in Hollywood. They wanted to believe. They really wanted to believe the things they were reading. The women would sit around and, "Do you believe this? They say so-and-so had 3 wives, and he had a girlfriend on the side." And, oh, I can't believe it.
It was very unflattering. I mean, not only the photographs were extremely unflattering, but the articles themselves were degrading and embarrassing to most of the stars. They were going after the dirt.
Scared is a mild word. Many of them were terrified, especially those in those days that had things to hide. Monday morning, if you didn't get to Schwab's drugstore or wherever you bought your copy of Confidential, they'd be sold out. Basically to find out if they were in it. And a lot of people cut down their social activities and indiscretion, so to speak, that they normally didn't care about, that in the days before Confidential was common here in Hollywood.
Confidential really started a reign of terror. People were scared to death that they did things that would eventually get into Confidential. And they had a right to fear what was going on.
Confidential was founded by a rogue New York newspaperman, Robert Harrison.
Hello. Hello, Mr. Robert Harrison.
By the mid-1950s, the magazine had made Harrison a national celebrity. He was a regular chat show guest.
It's confidential.
Every issue of Confidential made him $1 million and plenty of enemies.
Now, I saw you at Lindy's the other day, and I noticed that you have a brand new convertible Lincoln car, and yet you are one of the people that an awful lot of other people would think would like to be inconspicuous. How come you roll around that way, Bob?
Well, number one, I love the car. Number two, I don't have any fears of anyone because I don't feel I've ever done anything wrong. And if you feel that what you're doing is right, I imagine that no amount of harassment could stop you.
Confidential.
He was interested in making a name for himself, and he didn't have very much of an education. So he got into girly books. And then he got into whips and chains and all that other, the masochistic stuff. And eventually, to gain respectability, he started Confidential magazine. His original concept in 1952, when he started it, was to make it something like Time or Newsweek. But something inside him wouldn't let him do that because he was so girly-oriented and so scandal-minded. He wanted to create scandal.
Scandal was beckoning 3,000 miles away on the West Coast behind the lights of Hollywood. Harrison had no contacts in the town, so he enrolled Hollywood's top private detective, Fred Otash.
Bob Harrison had a niece called Marjorie Mead, who was married to a boy named Fred Mead. He sent him out here to be the front for Confidential magazine. And they formed a company called Hollywood Research. And the first person they called in the state of California was me. And they said, my uncle, Bob Harrison, told us to get in touch with you. Our law firm in New York wanted you to come on board and be the chief investigator on behalf of Confidential. And we'd like to know if you have any interest in doing that.
Otash became so famous through his work for Confidential that he starred in a documentary film about his methods of surveillance. Bugging phones, recording conversations, and using hidden cameras. Confidential would spend time and money watching the victim's apartment.
There was so much information around and stories around that you didn't have to fabricate it. You didn't have to resort to all kinds of sleazy detective work to verify these stories.
Another detective on the Otash team was his brother-in-law, Vic Abbey.
I was asked to do some work for Confidential magazine to corroborate whatever stories were told and see if the stories were true. At the time, the studios were trying to build up the Jayne Mansfield image. The studio was spending an awful lot of money on Jayne. And in that era, they felt that a woman that was single was more of a sex symbol than a married woman.
Can't help it, the girl can't help it. If she
got a lot of what they call the mo. Can't help it, the girl can't help it. The girl can't help it. She was born.
And they knew that she was involved with Mickey Haggerty. And I was assigned to go out and watch the activities in the evening to see if there was any contact made between the two.
Made the squeeze. Can't help it, the girl can't help it. I want you kindly be aware. The girl can't help it, the girl can't help it.
In those days, we had what you called an Ingersoll watch. And you could buy a dozen for $10. And if we couldn't keep our eyes open, or if we had to go to the men's room or go get a cup of coffee, we would take the watch, wind it up, set it for the time, and stick it under the tire. And if we came back and the car was gone, the watch would be crushed, and we would know that that's what the time the party left.
Fred Otash had files on most female stars in Hollywood, especially those who fell into the blonde bombshell category, like Ursula Andress, the sort of girl who might be linked to a big male star. He knew a good deal, too, about Anita Ekberg. She'd been his girlfriend for 2 years. When Confidential asked him to investigate Anita's involvement with Gary Cooper, Otash didn't let any personal feelings prevent him getting on with the job.
So Tipster
on Discovery Showcase.
Confidential was treated as sort of a joke at first, and even Humphrey Bogart said that everybody swears they don't read it, but it somehow gets into their houses, and they all claim that the cook brought it in. Well, they certainly did read it in those years.
Confidential was a terrible shock because the public didn't know this. It was just the people in the media, in the industry that knew what really went on behind the closed doors of those mansions in Beverly Hills.
People loved to gossip. They wanted to feel better than their idols in Hollywood. They wanted to believe. They really wanted to believe the things they were reading. The women would sit around and, do you believe this? They say so-and-so had 3 wives, and he had a girlfriend on the side. And, oh, I can't believe it.
It was very unflattering. I mean, not only the photographs were extremely unflattering, but the articles themselves were degrading and embarrassing to most of the stars. They were going after the dirt.
Scared is a mild word. Many of them were terrified, especially those in those days that had things to hide. Monday morning, if you didn't get to Schwab's drugstore or wherever you bought your copy of Confidential, they'd be sold out. Basically to find out if they were in it. And a lot of people cut down their social activities and indiscretion, so to speak, that they normally didn't care about, that in the days before Confidential was common here in Hollywood.
Confidential really started a reign of terror. People were scared to death that they did things that would eventually get into Confidential. And they had a right to fear what was going on.
Confidential was founded by a rogue New York newspaperman, Robert Harrison.
Hello. Hello, Mr. Robert Harrison.
By the mid-1950s, the magazine had made Harrison a national celebrity. He was a regular chat show guest.
It's confidential.
Every issue of Confidential made him $1 million and plenty of enemies.
Now, I saw you at Lindy's the other day, and I noticed that you have a brand new convertible Lincoln car, and yet you are one of the people that an awful lot of other people would think would like to be inconspicuous. How come you roll around that way, Bob?
Well, number one, I love the car. Number two, I I don't have any fears of anyone because I don't feel I've ever done anything wrong. And if you feel that what you're doing is right, I imagine that no amount of harassment could stop you.
Confidential.
He was interested in making a name for himself, and he didn't have very much of an education. So he got into girly books, and then he got into whips and chains and all that other, the masochistic stuff, and eventually, to gain respectability, he started Confidential magazine. His original concept in 1952, when he started it, was to make it something like Time or Newsweek. But something inside him wouldn't let him do that because he was so girly-oriented and so scandal-minded. He wanted to create scandal.
Scandal was beckoning 3,000 miles away on the West Coast behind the lights of Hollywood. Harrison had no contacts in the town, so he enrolled Hollywood's top private detective, Fred Otash.
Bob Harrison had a niece called Marjorie Meade, who was married to a boy named Fred Meade. He sent him out here to be the front for Confidential magazine. And they formed a company called Hollywood Research. And the first person they called in the state of California was me. And they said, my uncle, Bob Harrison, told us to get in touch with you. Our law firm in New York wanted you to come on board and be the chief investigator on behalf of Confidential. And we'd like to know if you have any interest in doing that.
Otash became so famous through his work for Confidential that he starred in a documentary film about his methods of surveillance. Bugging phones, recording conversations, and using hidden cameras. Confidential would spend time and money watching a victim's apartment.
There was so much information around and stories around that you didn't have to fabricate it. You didn't have to resort to all kinds of sleazy detective work to verify these stories.
Another detective on the Otash team was his brother-in-law, Vic Abbey.
I was asked to do some work for Confidential magazine to corroborate whatever stories were told and see if the stories were true. At the time, the studios were trying to build up the Jayne Mansfield image. The studio was spending an awful lot of money on Jayne. And in that era, they felt that a woman that was single was more of a sex symbol than a married woman.
Can't help it, the girl can't help it. If she got a lot of what they call the mo. Can't help it, the girl can't help it. The girl can't help it. She was born.
And they knew that she was involved with Mickey Haggerty. And I was assigned to go out and watch the activities in the evening to see if there was any contact made between the two.
Made the three. Can't help it, the girl can't help it. Won't you kindly be aware? The girl can't help it. The girl can't help it.
And in those days, we had what you called an Ingersoll watch. And you could buy a dozen for $10. And if we couldn't keep our eyes open, or if we had to go to the men's room or go get a cup of coffee, we would take the watch, wind it up, set it for the time, and stick it under the tire. And if we came back and the car was gone, the watch would be crushed, and we would know that that's what the time the party left.
Fred Otash had files on most female stars in Hollywood, especially those who fell into the blonde bombshell category, like Ursula Andress, the sort of girl who might be linked to a big male star. He knew a good deal, too, about Anita Ekberg. She'd been his girlfriend for 2 years. When Confidential asked him to investigate Anita's involvement with Gary Cooper, Otash didn't let any personal feelings prevent him getting on with the job.
Some tipster had given confidential information about Gary Cooper, his relationship with Anita Ekberg. And this tipster gave the man in my office the information as to when they were going to rendezvous together. And so Harrison requested that we put 3 cars on Gary Cooper. And we did. We put him on a surveillance with 3 cars.
Confidential spent a fortune on documenting what they called Gary Cooper's lost weekend with the former Miss Sweden.
He picked up Egbert, and they headed out to Malibu, where they checked in a motel. We photographed the pursuit of the car. We photographed checking in the motel. We went in and we got affidavit from the manager of the motel, got a copy of the registration of the motel. The tipster gave additional information to Confidential. We went out and interviewed the tipster and established other relationships that Gary Cooper had been involved in, not only in that one, but this is the one that was pinned down and was verified.
The magazine had plenty of other sources of scandal as well.
Confidential had marvelous contacts all over Hollywood, and no one knew who was feeding them. When a girl went out with a star, he'd give her $100 after the evening, and then she'd call Confidential, and Confidential would give her $500.
We had sources. I had every source in the world at this time: parking lot attendants, bartenders, prostitutes, madams, police officers, ex-police officers, bartenders. I mean, it was just limited. The information that was available was unbelievable.
Studios threatened to break legs all over town if they could find out who the leak was, because they knew it had to be somebody in the studio that was telling these stories, or it had to be a movie star's press agent or somebody, some blackie that worked that was looking for, because Confidential would pay good money for an idea, an item, and then they'd follow up on it.
In 1956, Confidential brought a story that Kim Novak was being kept in a Hollywood apartment by a millionaire, but was at the same time being visited by a young actor. When that relationship ended, the embittered actor phoned Confidential, but the man who discovered Kim Novak got the blame.
I was third in command of the studio while they were in production. I arrived at work, normal hour on Monday morning, and there was a note on my desk upon arrival to immediately go to Mr. Cohn's office, Harry Cohn, who was the head of Columbia Pictures and owner of the studio. I got to his office. They ushered me in immediately. He announced to me that I'm discharged, clean my desk out, be off the lot by noon, and stop by the cashier. There's a 6-month severance check. So in a fog, I went to the cashier, cleaned out my desk, and walked around in the fog for a week. Well, the following Monday morning, when Confidential magazine hit the stands, apparently someone in publicity at Columbia had gotten an issue ahead of time. There was an article about Kim Novak and a wealthy man from New York who was keeping her at the time. And he was an intimate friend of mine, as she was, because I'd brought her on the lot at Columbia. And I was the natural suspect. I was tried and convicted. And for 2 years, I was blackballed.
In his search for scandal, Harrison was prepared to offer money to anyone, including top show business writers.
I was in Lindy's one night, and I was on my way to the men's room. I think that was a proper vista for me, talking to Robert Harrison. He came up and said to me, Mr. O'Brien, I'm Bob Harrison. And I said, yes. He said, do you know me? I said, well, who are you? And I know who he was, of course. And he said, well, I'm the editor and publisher of Confidential magazine. And I said, what do you want with me? And he said, well, I'd like you to write for me. I said, no, thanks. He says, I pay very big money. I said, I'm very rich, and I walked away.
I said, no, I would not like to write for it. He said, well, you don't have to sign your name to anything. I said, no, I don't want to write for it or have anything to do with it. It's just not my cup of tea. I was trying to be as polite as possible. And then he said, look, can you give us any tips on stories? If you do, we pay very handsomely. He said, for example, I understand that Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis are really homosexuals having a love affair. Give us some, and you've written about them, you know both men.
Why do I myself?
And I said, that's absolutely ridiculous and untrue and nonsense. And he said, well, I'm pursuing that story, and I'm going to publish it, and what could they do anyhow? It seemed to me that he was just obsessed with trying to portray people in Hollywood as perverts, and he seemed to have the idea that he could get away with murder.
We will return to Hollywood Confidential on Discovery Showcase. Hollywood Confidential now returns on Discovery Showcase.
Confidential flouted one of Hollywood's strictest taboos, the mention of homosexuality. Dozens of actors who were gay knew the unwritten law: keep it secret or be dismissed.
They couldn't be open at all. Almost no one knew. If they were really bad, like Rock Hudson, if they were really super indiscreet, he was really indiscreet. I don't know how the world didn't know about it, because he just picked them up on the street corners. We all knew in the business that he was a homosexual. So when we would see him at parties, we'd just go, "Hi, Rock," and keep going.
Rock Hudson, they got involved with an Italian movie star. Not a famous movie star, but a movie star when he was doing the picture over there. And they had a homosexual relationship. And he brought him back here. And then Rock Hudson felt that he no longer had any interest in him. And he wanted to break off the relationship. And this little Italian boy wouldn't go away. And he started threatening to expose him. And I met Rock Hudson in Palm Springs. He told me the situation. And I arranged some of my contacts to have this boy deported.
There's always so little time, isn't there, when we need it the most?
There's nothing new to us. We're always saying goodbye.
Confidential dug up the fact that Rock Hudson was a homosexual.
Will you remember me?
Yes. I'd better go now.
Tell me. Tell me.
You know already.
Tell me just the same.
There are macho men who happen to like men, but the common misconception is that all homosexuals are kind of limp-wristed, effeminate people. And so Universal went to Confidential and gave the then editor $10,000, but that wasn't enough. They also promised, now $10,000 was a lot of money then, they also promised him in return, if he'd kill the Rock Hudson story, they would give him a story on another one of their stars in exchange.
There are times when a man takes stock of himself. He asks himself a question about won or lost.
Rory Calhoun, who was at that time, was a very, very big star. Early in life had done a series of burglaries and been in prison. He had another name. Rory Calhoun wasn't his real name. And so Confidential printed a big story on Rory Calhoun and killed a story on Rock Hudson. An editor for whom I worked said, "We'd like to send you out to Hollywood. The studio has recently arranged for Rock Hudson to get married to a woman, by the way, so that it would show people these innuendos were not true." And I dutifully went out here and I met Rock and the new Mrs. Hudson, and a very nice couple. I knew they were not
really married. I thought, but maybe they were. I didn't care too much. They seemed very happy. And then I also interviewed Rory. I spent a lot of time with Rory, and he began to talk about what had happened. And he told me that he'd been offered up as a sacrificial lamb to get him to kill the Rock Hudson story.
Main Street, USA, at peace, unaware that a cabal of conspirators plots its enslavement.
In the Cold War of the 1950s, America fell into a fever of anti-communism. Everyday subversives were being unearthed in government departments and the armed forces.
The mayor is hustled off to jail, and then the chief of police.
It wasn't long before those conducting the witch hunt realized that disclosures of a more sensational kind could be made in Hollywood.
From now on.
Confidential jumped on the red-baiting bandwagon, making its own reckless accusations. The magazine was being edited at the time by a leading anti-communist journalist, Howard Rushmore.
Were there any other sacred cows in the movie industry?
We might, in this connection, make sacred red cows. Edward G. Robinson would fall in that category.
I'm no good at a thing like this. A little.
When the Inquisition turned to Hollywood, there were some stars who could hardly wait to rush forward to show that they were politically untainted.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
I have never read Karl Marx, and I don't know the basis of communism beyond what I've picked up from hearsay. What I've heard, I don't like it, because it isn't on the level.
It's not accidental that that was a period of the scandal sheet. One of the threats that was made against people was that they would, their political indiscretions would be reported in the gossip columns of the day and in scandal magazines like Confidential magazine.
We had a number of very complimentary articles on Robinson.
He was a notorious newspaperman.
As I remember.
There was no ethical bounds. There was no line where they say, well, this is too much. You're going to drive this man to suicide if you publish this. He would publish anything that he thought he could get away with, and a lot that he didn't get away with. He would include you in his column, and you were not a communist, but the very fact that he named you in this column for having done such and such, the innuendo was, aha, watch this guy. So he was trained before he ever got to Confidential to work with innuendo and to work with smear.
I don't know whether or not Robinson is a communist. I have no knowledge of that. But 10 years ago or more, he started joining one communist front after another. Perhaps innocently, but after 10 years, he's still doing it. I noticed that...
It was people like Rushmore that created the impression of spies running amok in this country when there was no evidence in court that could seemingly justify that.
Certainly. It's one of their oldest and most reliable communist fronts.
The most vivid memory I have is in covering the appeal of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, people convicted supposedly of giving the secret of the atom bomb to the Soviet Union. And there was Rushmore, all 6'5" or 6 of them, stretched out fast asleep. Just a perfect example of the climate of the times. For me, it's sunk in my mind. Don't bother me with the facts. I know them all. I don't need to know anything more. And sleeping, literally covering the story and fast asleep.
Is the League of American Writers a communist organization? It was founded by the Communist Party, and its first convention that...
Rushmore had been the star columnist on the ultra-right-wing newspaper, the Journal American, but he made so many mistakes through his heavy drinking that he was fired.
No sooner was he fired from the Journal American than Bob Harrison jumped on him, gave him an offer he couldn't refuse, and told him, or misled him, that he was going to write anti-communist stories. But he wasn't there more than a few days when Harrison began to ask him to write stories exposing movie stars. And he dispatched him to Hollywood to find sources because he was such a good investigative reporter. So he went out there and he ran into Frances DeScaffa, the wife of actor Bruce Cabot. And he promised to pay her big bucks, provided she gave him inside information on the stars. She says, I'll get it for you even if I have to go to bed with him. And as a result, he was able to do about 22 sensational stories with Confidential.
One of the most sensational and, as it turned out, significant stories printed by Rushmore involved Joe DiMaggio, probably the greatest baseball player of all time. He married Marilyn Monroe before she became a major star. Before long, though, Marilyn became better known than Joe. He couldn't stand being called Mr. Marilyn Monroe. The marriage lasted only 9 months, but Joe remained possessive and dangerously jealous.
DiMaggio was very much in love with her. They were talking to each other on the phone every day. And he had put detectives on, hired a company called City Detectives. And he had put Monroe under surveillance. So Frank Sinatra, Joe DiMaggio, Billy Karam, and Patsy D'Amour, who owned Villa Capri, were all having dinner at the Villa Capri.
I happened to be in the Villa Capri, and of course Joe DiMaggio was separated from Marilyn Monroe, and but he was a very, very jealous man, and he had a feeling that she was shacked up with, I think, a makeup man in an apartment, and he wanted to go over and bust in on her, and in fairness to Frank, Frank tried to talk him out of it. And he said, nah, forget it, Joe. You're not married to her anymore. But anyhow, you can't, DiMaggio, you know, you get an Italian mad boy, he's going to do something. So they went, and Frank went along.
Confidential broke the story of what became known as the Wrong Door Raid. DiMaggio and friends with private detective Barney Raditsky burst into an apartment near Waring Street, Hollywood, expecting to surprise Marilyn with a lover.
Mr. Sinatra, were you in the vicinity of 8122 Waring Street on the night of November the 5th, 1954?
I was.
Will you tell the committee the circumstance under which you happened to be there?
Well, I drove Mr. DiMaggio to the general area. And didn't...
You mean Mr. Joe DiMaggio?
There's only one that I know of, actually.
There are 5 brothers.
Well, he's probably the hottest one.
When they arrived, one of them had a gun. And he was drunk. It's the first time the story's ever been told, okay? So no one's ever told this before. So Raditsky, being an ex-cop and not stupid, and knowing DiMaggio and Sinatra for many years, said, well, the best thing for me to do is to point to the wrong door. Because if we point to the right door, and they kick that door in, and that gun might go off, someone's going to get hurt.
And they kicked in the door, and there's an old maid, about 55 years old, in bed, and, you know, sound asleep, and all of a sudden her door is kicked open, and there's the greatest baseball player since Babe Ruth, and the greatest singer of the 20th century standing there.
In publishing the Wrong Door Raid story, Confidential made 2 blunders. It had offended Sinatra, who had influential friends, and it had forced the state to take notice of Confidential. It didn't like what it saw.
We will return to Hollywood Confidential on Discovery. Just 6 weeks before the outbreak of World War II, amateur German filmmakers shot footage at a Munich arts festival. Everyone who was anyone was there. Everyone. Don't miss Good Morning, Mr. Hitler. Then, Berlin, 1945. How many died to take the city? Was it necessary? Watch Berlin at all costs. This Sunday, beginning at 9 Eastern, 8 Central, only on Discovery Sunday. Now returns on Discovery Showcase.
One of the first retaliations against a Confidential smear story came from an unexpected quarter. For years, Liberace had tried to close his ears to talk that he was a homosexual. Confidential said bluntly that he'd chased a young publicity man several times round several rooms across several states, demanding a kiss. As the story put it, he was mad about the boy. Liberace cared very much about the allegation, in spite of the song he sang so often at the time.
I don't care.
Liberace had toured England, and another scandalous article was written by a columnist named Cassandra, who described Liberace, whom he had never met, in the most outrageous hyperbole, some of the most purple prose ever written since Restoration times, I would gather. And of course, there again, Liberace was outraged and had to protect his honor for a very important reason, because when he played in these English music halls, the Teddy Boys were in the back of the theater yelling, "Go home, you fag," and "We don't want any fairies here." And of course, if that sort of happening had transferred itself to America, it could have been the end of Liberace's career.
Liberace sued Confidential for $25 million.
To assist me in this fight is my attorney and good friend, Mr. John R. Jacobs, Jr.
How did you arrive at that $25 million figure?
I arrived at this figure because for the past several years, I have earned an average of $1 million a year, and I have a life expectancy in the entertainment industry of at least another 20 years, and therefore this figure was arrived at. However, there is no price that can be placed on a person's reputation.
I think they got a little careless, and I think some of the things they ran, they went overboard, and they started to get lawsuits. Eventually, if you have just too many lawsuits, it'll finish it.
They got, I believe, at least 2 affidavits sworn under oath from each source for each story. They then had investigators check it out because they wanted to make sure. I mean, the last thing Confidential wanted was somebody to successfully sue them in a civil libel case. Then they had all these lawyers that they were paying a ton of money to in New York go over the stories. And I think I have never seen a magazine expend that effort, that time, and that money to make sure they weren't libeling somebody.
In the case of Dorothy Dandridge, Confidential obviously hadn't spent enough time, money, or care on checking their story. Dandridge was one of the first black actresses to be allowed by Hollywood to play roles other than servants. Dandridge, Confidential alleged, had casually met a white musician and had slipped into the woods with him.
Well, I had met Dorothy Dandridge. Of course, she was a very well-known individual. And we talked for a long time, and I liked her very much. I thought she was a very attractive, intelligent human being. And when Confidential wrote a story about her having an affair up in the high country when she worked up at Lake Tahoe, I was really, really angry. And I don't think there's ever been a prosecution for criminal libel before or since in California. And I prosecuted the Confidential for criminal libel.
I feel very happy, and I feel that I have...
Dorothy Dandridge was happy to go along with California's action against Confidential. Her Hollywood career, just launched with the film Carmen Jones, was in jeopardy.
The whole thing all over again, but I don't really mind that. I'll keep repeating it and keep coming back and keep telling them this particular article is a lie, because it is, and it's no more true now than it was several months ago when they first printed it.
When the stars began to get their own strength, and they could negotiate their own contracts, and they didn't have to fall victims to the movie studios' demands for less pay, and they wanted more pay, that's when the magazine got into trouble.
Confidential compounded that trouble by claiming that Maureen O'Hara had been seen making love in one of the back rows of Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. O'Hara was not the kind of woman to be pushed around.
Thank God for Maureen O'Hara. She became quite a heroine in this town. because the stand she took, don't tangle with this dame. She's tangled with John Wayne and people like that. She's a real tough Irish cookie.
This incident never occurred in Grauman's Chinese or any other theater.
And she beat Confidential.
And it is a complete pack of lies, vicious, horrible lies.
And who gave you leave to be kissing me?
So you can talk.
Yes, I can, I will, and I do. That's more than talk you'll be getting if you...
After the O'Hara story and the attack on Dorothy Dandridge, the studio bosses decided it was time to act against Confidential.
Louis B. Mayer, Harry Cohn, Darryl Zanuck, and Jack Warner were so powerful they could do anything.
The movie industry was a major part of California's economy. The moguls who ran it were able to bring heavy political pressure to bear to protect their stars, their pictures, and their profits.
And all I got that man can get.
It's common knowledge today that they went in there finally and said, we're going to stop this, and they did.
The way they did was to persuade the state of California itself to prosecute Confidential over the Dandridge story.
My feeling is, although I have no evidence of it, that the studio bosses met with the governor and said, we've got to do something about this, and the governor and the attorney general filed a suit against Confidential for criminal libel.
Well, you can take my solemn word for it that the motion picture industry had nothing to do with this prosecution. It was a judgment that I made based upon my personal knowledge of Dorothy Dandridge and what I considered and knew to be a fine human being.
So take your cue, boy. Don't say I didn't tell.
It was generally believed at the time that the major studios had put together a slush fund of over $500,000 to ensure the end of the magazine.
Give me a chicken sandwich.
May 1957. The trial of Confidential opened in Los Angeles. Although the city was sweltering and choking in smog of record density, in the courtroom there was standing room only. After 5 months, the trial ended in uproar. The jury had failed to agree, split 7-5. The defense claimed this as a victory. But the fatal blow for the magazine which had once terrorized Hollywood fell 1 month later, in November 1957. Faced with a costly retrial, the magazine entered into an agreement that it would never in future publish scandalous stories about private lives. The magazine had written its own death warrant. Because of the agreement, Harrison's Confidential failed within weeks. It was never able to report Rock Hudson's death from AIDS, Liberace dying in the same way, the suicide of Dorothy Dandridge, and Howard Rushmore blowing his brains out. Without the magic ingredient of scandal, Robert Harrison had killed off his own creation, Hollywood Confidential.